Listen to this.
Wrestling with regret. Let's get it. Yeah.
I've had a lot to say about Bill Goldberg over the years. I mean, one of my first videos I ever did was taking a look at his first WWE run back in 2003, one of the many former WCW stars who'd go through Vince McMahon's meat grinder post-buyout. That run was not great, but then came a surprising return more than a decade later. The main event of the 2016 Survivor Series saw Goldberg decimate Brock Lesnar in minutes. That and everything he's done since his return more or less makes up for that first run. Well, it did until the returns really began to diminish. That being said, it's impossible to deny Goldberg's legitimate and massive impact on pro wrestling since it was at its most popular. There are a few phenomena in the industry who burst onto the scene quite like he did. By the spring of 1998, less than a year into his run, Goldberg Mania was the rocket fuel that looked to carry World Championship Wrestling into the future, just as the buzz around the New World Order was beginning to fade. But as Bill's fortunes went, so did the fate of WCW. And this week here on Wrestling with Regret, we're going to look at that first run that made him a household name. To Atlanta! After playing professional football for 7 seasons, Bill Goldberg's career in that sport ended due to injury. It wasn't too long after he healed up that he was recruited into wrestling by Sting and Lex Luger, who had seen him lifting in their Atlanta area gyms. Despite not being a fan of the Graps, he ended up taking their advice and signed up for the WCW power plant. After surviving their rigorous training, Goldberg made his debut in a dart match by defeating his trainer, Sergeant Buddy Lee Parker, under the name Bill Gold. Imagine some alternate universe where that name stuck but everything else was the same. Could you imagine fans chanting, "Gold! Gold!"
Gold. Always believe in your soul.
After a handful of other burglous dark matches, WCW officials noticed the reactions their man was getting, solely based on his look and his intensity. EVP Eric Bischoff noticed this as well. Since the early days of Monday Nitro, Bischoff had always wanted to embrace a more reality-based style of programming, Dungeon of Doom and Glacier notwithstanding. Eric apparently thought that WWF had dropped the ball with Ken Shamrock after his initial presentation as the world's most dangerous man and believed he could do better.
A newcomer here in Bill Goldberg, a man we know absolutely nothing about.
September 22nd, 1997, Salt Lake City, Utah. Bill Goldberg officially arrived on the scene in WCW to zero fanfare. Despite looking like a jacked Steve Austin, he was otherwise pretty nondescript, especially in comparison to his opponent, the colorful Hugh Morris. But it was no laughing matter as Goldberg shocked the fans in attendance by beating Morris in quick and dominant fashion, then brushed past Mean Gene's attempt at a post-match interview. In the Mormon capital of the world, this big, bald Jewish man from Oklahoma had suddenly put everyone on notice. It's hard to think of Goldberg as anything else but that stoic, isolated lone wolf character, but before they really knew what they had with him, one of Goldberg's earliest storylines had him at the beck and call of someone else. Just as Goldberg began picking up steam, he was briefly miscast in the role of Deborah McMichael's toady of sorts, as the beauty queen hired him to attack her ex-husband Steve McMichael at Halloween Havoc and steal his Super Bowl ring. On the surface, it's not the worst angle in the world, it's just a shame that no one involved could talk worth a damn. Even at this point in his career, I'd guess that Bill's mic work would have placed him at worst second out of the 3 of them. Goldberg beat Mongo in a match at Starrcade, and despite being cast as the heel, he had the clear support of the fans on that night, which helped to redirect him back to his natural course. But every rookie needs a big test to prove their mettle, and Bill certainly got that in the form of Steven Regal. On an episode of Nitro in February of '98, Regal famously embarrassed Goldberg in a 6-minute match, the longest he'd had on TV up to that point. Though Goldberg still picked up the Duke, he looked lost and utterly flummoxed when having to try and exchange holds with the man from Blackpool. This wasn't done intentionally, as Regal's maintained he simply did what he was told to do by WCW. When he was chewed out in the back later on, Regal famously said, "Eric, I can't hit myself." Goldberg, meanwhile, has said that he believes Regal took liberties with him in the ring. But don't worry, Bill, I'm sure that match won't follow you around for the rest of your career. Though to be fair, calling Goldberg Greenberg is pretty hilarious. Goldberg kept his winning ways for weeks on end, spearing and jackhammering jobbers with ease, and before long they began making a big deal of the streak on television. The wins kept coming against the likes of Brad Armstrong and Perry Saturn, with hair! By Spring Stampede 98, when he fought Saturn, he was allegedly at 73 wins, 0 losses. I say allegedly since the story always went that WCW juiced up the numbers to make them look more impressive, but if you include house show dates, he easily could have hit that number by then. Then again, if you include those, it opens up a whole can of worms as to what you count from house shows and what you don't. So, yeah, they definitely fudged the numbers. After beating one flock member at Stampede, Goldberg followed it up one night later on Nitro by crushing Raven and the whole rest of his group to capture the US Championship. At 75-0, the fans were loving what they saw in Goldberg. I mean, it's easy to see why Bill became so popular. He wasn't flashy, but he looked convincing, like he could actually kill you in the ring. He was a winner. He was a dominant winner, but he wasn't a dick about it. He didn't talk, but he also didn't have to. He didn't have some outlandish ring name. He was just Bill Goldberg, the kind of name you'd have for a next-door neighbor or your science teacher. Whether WCW intended to or not, by keeping things painfully simple and booking him strong, they created a massive fan favorite. They capitalized by continuing that focused simplicity. They dropped Bill from his name. His theme music was a low and steady military anthem. His catchphrase a brief 2 words. It was to the point. It was blunt. It was forceful. It was effective. In a company known for its gaffes, this time they had truly struck gold. Bill Gold. Oh, but I forgot to mention, all those Goldberg chants that used to fill the arenas, apparently those used to be piped in through the speakers. Apparently they kept things so simple, they assumed that the fans were simple too. Goldberg's rapid rise in popularity caught the attention of one of wrestling's most notorious politicians in Hollywood Hogan, then the WCW champion. According to legend, it was the Hulkster who suggested that he put the newcomer over in front of 40,000 people at the Georgia Dome, the site of the July 6th edition of Nitro. Many of those fans would be local Turner executives watching their one and only wrestling show of the year who had no idea the Hogan-Goldberg showdown had only been announced a few days before on Thunder, but would think it played a role in the draw regardless. Factoids? Schmacktoids, brother. Goldberg wrestled Scott Hall earlier in the show as a warm-up match, then it came time for the main event. To his credit, Hogan worked as hard as he ever did in WCW to put Goldberg over as a world beater who couldn't be bested by 1,000 legends on that night. Bill had even kicked out of multiple leg drops. One jackhammer was all it took for Demand to be christened as the new world champion. It was a ratings bonanza for WCW as they bested that week's episode of Raw, one of the last times that ever happened. In a way, it felt like a make-good for how badly the previous year's Starrcade main event ended, righting the wrong and giving fans the finish they'd been craving. This was seriously an awesome moment to watch live on TV as it was happening. The crowd was hyped, they were throwing shit in the ring, there was a diamond cutter involved, Bobby Heenan screaming at the top of his lungs on commentary. It was total chaos and it ended in the best possible way, and seriously an all-time moment for WCW. People complain these days about the fact that, oh, they hot-shotted the match on TV when you could have made some money on a pay-per-view, and yeah, they're right, but at the same time, screw it, this was the time. Take a look at Hollywood Hogan's dance card for the rest of that year. DDP, Karl Malone, Jay Leno, and the Ultimate Warrior, all before he, quote, retired to run for, quote, president. When exactly would that pay-per-view match for the title have taken place? One would have to assume that the main events of Bash at the Beach and Road Wild were internally scheduled well in advance, so no title matches until after those at least. And assuming Warrior doesn't sign with WCW to rekindle his feud with Hogan, you could build a Goldberg-Hogan matchup for Fall Brawl at the earliest, but that's 2 whole months away. And considering where WCW was headed at the time, did they really have 2 months to spare? Personally, I can never begrudge WCW for making that call. Goldberg was white hot. There was little left for him to do as the unbeaten US champion, and I believe that stalling that payoff would have hurt more than helped. Just booking a rematch a few months down the line on pay-per-view could have done great business, but they failed to do it before Hogan's hiatus, or ever in fact. And here's the thing, even though Hogan was no longer the champion, those celebrity matches he was involved in were treated as the main events, above the newly crowned badass world champ. Sound familiar? Less than a week after he won the gold, Berg beat Curt Hennig to retain. Hennig's awesome and everything, but hadn't been positioned in the main event for some time. At Road Wild, the champ didn't even defend the belt as he won an NWO Invitational Battle Royal. Then at Fall Brawl, he wasn't even on the card at all. Brawl. But it's not for lack of trying. It was around this time that TV champion Chris Jericho tried to initiate a program that would end in a match with a quick win for Goldberg. But Goldberg had decided he'd rather do nothing for a while than entertain some cruiserweights idea, and that was that, until 2003. Finally, at Halloween Havoc, the champ got his first pay-per-view main event against Diamond Dallas Page. It was an amazing match, easily one of the best of Bill's career. But need I remind you, this is WCW we're talking about, so they were bound to screw it up. The company decided to have Havoc run 3.5 hours, more than the standard 3 for a pay-per-view, but failed to notify the cable systems carrying the show about the need for an extension. Therefore, roughly a quarter of the pay-per-view audience had their feeds cut just as the world title match was set to begin. If the last thing I saw on this show was Hollywood Hogan fiddle-fucking around with flash paper followed by the debut of his nephew Horace, I'd be furious. This blunder cost WCW in the upwards of 7 figures in pay-per-view refunds. They made up for it by replaying the match the following night on Nitro, which ironically helped the show beat Raw once more, and for the final time. Once again, the world champion was not featured on the World War III pay-per-view, though that show's signature match did end with Kevin Nash winning and earning a shot at Goldberg the following month. Hey, remember how cool it was when the NWO first debuted? God, that was a cool stable. It's too bad the original trio splintered off and all these different NWO factions were created. Hey, let's try doing it all over again, but different. And so the sinister plot began at Starrcade. After a so-so event, fans were primed for a showdown between two of the most popular stars in the company. After enduring interference from Bam Bam Bigelow and the Disco Inferno, Goldberg was downed by Scott Hall, disguised as a security guard and armed with a taser, seemingly unbeknownst to Nash. The 173-0 streak was finally broken, and Big Sexy won his first WCW championship. The fans went nuts upon witnessing this piece of history, but as someone who watched this event, scrambled, it felt kind of deflating. Nash was cool and all, but he certainly didn't need the title, and it felt like there was a lot of gas left in the tank for Goldberg in his unbeaten run. Make that 3 Starrcades in a row where the main event has fans feeling more bewildered than satisfied. Just 1 week later, the wheels were really beginning to fall off the Goldberg train. That's when Nash offered the former champ a rematch in the main event of the January 4th episode of Nitro. January 4th. What's so special about January 4th? How could I forget? What happens here is widely considered one of the biggest booking blunders of the Monday Night War. Goldberg was taken away by police on suspicion of stalking Miss Elizabeth. That same episode, Hollywood Hogan ended his fake retirement to take Goldberg's place in the title match with Nash. And soon after fans were given permission to tune to Raw to watch Mankind win the WWF title, Nash flopped on the ground to let Hogan cover him for the win and the belt. Then as that facade ended, Goldberg returned from the clink with a vengeance, only to be beaten down and spray painted as the NWO factions reunited to create the NWO Elite. Great! This past year was a waste. WCW chose to set aside those obvious rematches with Hogan or Nash and allowed Goldberg to get some half-boiled revenge against Scott Hall at Sold Out, a ladder match where the infamous taser was the prize hanging above. Damn, Chico, imagine going from working ladder matches with Shawn Michaels to Goldberg. I'd have quit. Goldberg's obvious destiny was sidetracked yet again by Bam Bam Bigelow at Super Brawl the next month, then he was inexplicably left off the card at Uncensored in March. Well, obviously Goldberg can't get his revenge on Hogan and the NWO yet. Ric Flair's gotta do it first. Yes, it was time to relive the feud we'd seen on and off for the last 5 years as temporary president Ric Flair challenged Hollywood for the title in the main event of Uncensored. The ensuing madness of the first blood steel cage match resulted in a double turn of sorts, as new champion Flair became the evil president for life, lol, turning Hogan and by extension the whole of the NWO babyface. Resolutions. Who needs them? Later that month, Bret Hart outsmarted Goldberg and took a spear while wearing a big steel plate around its abdomen. This kick-ass moment naturally went nowhere, but Bill did get his win back against Kevin Nash at Spring Stampede. Man, speared that ref right in the dick. Goldberg's issue with Hogan was seemingly abandoned as our hero was taken out by the Steiners as a way to write him off so he could film his role in the Universal Soldier sequel. He returned at Road Wild to beat Rick, then beat Diamond Dallas Page of the Jersey Triad at Fall Brawl. WCW was in shambles by this point, going from being the most profitable wrestling company in history to losing millions. In September of '99, Eric Bischoff was relieved of his duties, so it was time for the company to get back to basics and pull themselves up by their bootstraps. Yes, it was time for Vince Russo to step in and take charge of this failing company. Desperate to stay competitive, WCW plucked their competition's head writer out from under the WWF's figurative nose with the hope that he could turn their fortunes around like he did in the Fed. To his credit, Russo understood that Goldberg should be a big focus, even if the path to get him there had more twists and turns than a Bugs Bunny trip to Albuquerque. Halloween Havoc 99 was the first pay-per-view under the Russo regime and saw Goldberg beat Sid Vicious to become the US champion once again. The build for this match included Sid copying Goldberg's shtick and creating a win streak of his own, one even more ludicrously inflated than Bill's. Oh, so this kind of mockery is okay, but Jericho's wasn't? Theirs was a hard-hitting match with what some would call a flat ending, as it didn't end with a pinfall but referee stoppage due to Sid bleeding too much. But that wasn't the end of Goldberg's night. One match prior, Hulk Hogan laid down for Sting to win the WCW Championship, a move that had everyone asking questions but would get no real answers. The title would change hands for a second time in the real main event when Sting issued an open challenge and Goldberg answered it, though there seemed to be some confusion on air as to whether or not it was for the title. But suddenly, Goldberg was a double champion again and all would be right with the... I forgot. WCW. Goldberg's world title win was nullified by J.J. Dillon on Nitro. Then on that same night, he lost the U.S. title to Bret Hart after an attack by Scott Hall, Kevin Nash, and Sid. The gears were seemingly in motion for Goldberg's big push back to the top. At the Mayhem pay-per-view, Bret went on to win a tournament to crown a new WCW champion, finally undoing the terrible booking he'd been forced to put up with after coming into the company red hot. On that same show, Goldberg fought Sid yet again, this time in an I Quit match. Why'd they make this match, you might ask? Well, Sid claimed that during their last fight, he heard Goldberg say I quit. He even had some damning video evidence. I quit! Did he never recover from all that blood loss at Halloween Havoc?
And I have half the brain that you do.
Once again, Goldberg won the match, but again, not in the traditional sense. Despite having I Quit rules, Sid never said those two words as the referee called the match. Come on, Sid, even Bob Backlund was able to get some noises out. A rematch between Bret and Goldberg was set for Starrcade, and as he did with Stone Cold and The Undertaker a year before in the Federation, Russo opted to build the match with another can they coexist storyline. Before the match? Yeah, maybe they could. But now?
Today's date is August 7th, 2022. Does Bret Hart like Bill Goldberg?
No.
December 19th, 1999, Washington, D.C. In a match that affected the remainder of both men's careers, Hart suffered a severe concussion due to an errant kick by Big Bill partway through. But even with his head swirling, Bret still might not have been as befuddled as the audience was at the end.
Sharpshooter! Put the sharpshooter on! Fight the soldier!
In perhaps one of the laziest recreations of the Montreal Screwjob we've ever seen, Roddy Piper showed up apropos of nothing in a referee's shirt, looking completely over this shit, meandered to the ring, and called the match in Bret's favor the moment he walked in. What was it with Starrcade and WCW's utter inability for it to just end on a good, sensical note? But hey, remember the NWO? Remember how cool they were, everyone? Let's try it again, but worse! The next night on Nitro, Bret Hart offered Goldberg a rematch for the title. That match ended with Roddy Piper covering Goldberg to protect him from a beatdown, which the referee counted as a pin and awarded to Bret. And to top it all off, it was a setup for yet another NWO reunion, this time with Hart, Nash, Hall, Jeff Jarrett, and later Scott Steiner. Now hang on, what's with this silver look of theirs? Isn't silver worth less than, say, gold? I guess honesty is the best policy. This magic spell meant to resurrect WCW turned out to be a curse. Within a month, Bret was off the road, forced to retire as a result of his concussion. As for Bill, karma came calling when he cut the shit out of his arm punching through a car window on Nitro, taking himself out of action for several months. Apparently, he was given a lead pipe to break the window with, but silly mortals, Goldberg needs no weapons as he can break the window all by himself. Oh God, get the medic. With Bret gone, the Radicals having recently jumped ship, and now Goldberg injured, WCW was in a tailspin yet again. But hey, if one failed executive couldn't turn things around, why not try with two? By April of 2000, Vince Russo had left and come back to WCW, this time with an also returning Eric Bischoff. The two were tasked with getting WCW back on track, and they did just that with a full championship reset and the debut of the New World Order. I'm sorry, no, I meant the New Blood, because heaven forbid we get those mixed up. The gigantic New Blood stable was a faction of disenfranchised young wrestlers, and Brian Knobbs and Scott Steiner. Basically, it was for anyone on the roster who wasn't a long-time established main eventer in what was called the Millionaires Club. Now, one would think that when Goldberg comes back from injury, he would join the side of the babyface main eventers. But
He's waiting for him to get up. He's up. Holy!
what the hell is with these poorly timed heel turns committed by the company's biggest bald stars? Goldberg returned to help Jeff Jarrett beat Kevin Nash at the Great American Bash in a turn absolutely nobody asked for, especially Goldberg himself. Bill had been hesitant in turning heel as he considered himself a role model to younger fans and felt that turning would be a betrayal to them. And you can argue whether or not he was justified in thinking that, but after all the other demoralizing twists and turns fans had to put up with for the last 2 years, it was even more disheartening to see one of WCW's top heroes go to the dark side. I mean, look at him eating Scott Hall's contract. What a monster! But Heelberg lasted for less time than an average world title reign in WCW before he suddenly snapped on Vinnie Rue and told him to Vinnie screw himself. No doubt trying to recreate the magic of the Vince McMahon-Steve Austin feud, Goldberg and Russo engaged in a piddling version of it over the fall, with Russo proclaiming that if Goldberg failed to recreate his legendary streak, he'd be forced to retire from wrestling. Now watch me win the world title, bro! In a match that A, featured Vince Russo, B, was for the WCW Championship, C, was in a cage, and D, featured Vince freaking Russo, Goldberg speared his hated rival through the cell wall, but in doing so, gave Russo the win and the title. That spear did give Russo a concussion, so maybe Bill could be forgiven for Bret. But the odds remained stacked against Goldberg for the remainder of the year. After winning a handicap match versus Chronic, he soon pivoted to a feud with Lex Luger and Buff Bagwell. In perhaps the most anticlimactic final match anyone could have imagined for a superstar once poised to rescue the company from certain doom, Goldberg teamed up with his power plant trainer Buddy Lee Parker at January's Sin pay-per-view to take on Totally Buff. A fan who we saw earlier in the show maced Goldberg and was bafflingly allowed to stick around as Da Man took the pin from Luger. A sin indeed. By the way, for those of you still wondering, this thumbnail is a reference to Final Fantasy X. His name is Sin. Hope that clears everything up. The loss was a way for Goldberg to take time off, while Eric Bischoff worked on a deal to purchase WCW from Turner and do yet another reboot, dubbed The Big Bang. Instead, Sin was the last we would see of Goldberg in the company, as it was sold 2 months later as he recovered from shoulder surgery. And that was the story of Bill Goldberg's time in WCW. Yeah, suddenly I don't feel so bad about his first WWE run anymore. WCW made Goldberg a living legend, but they're also at least partly responsible for everything that happened in the last year or so. Goldberg beating Hogan for the title was huge and was one of the last truly feel-good moments WCW had, but it was never really followed up on due to bad timing, political shenanigans, and a refusal to move on from the past. A lot of choices we look back on negatively today could have been the opposite if the powers that be in WCW were able to get out of their own way. The streak was a killer gimmick, but once they ended it prematurely, they were never able to recapture the magic of that early run, and things just went downhill from there. Goldberg's story is one of the many cautionary tales to be gleaned from the rise and fall of WCW, but at least they never made him wear a wig. But what did you think of Goldberg's ups and downs in WCW? Did that streak turn you into a fan? Let me know in the comments section below. Be sure to give the video a thumbs up if you like it, subscribe to Wrestling with Regret, hit that bell icon to get all the notifications for when new content drops. I'm Brian Zane, and I'll see you next time.